This is one of those stories I've been sitting on for a really long time. It happened back when I was maybe 25 or 26, way before I met my wife and way before we had kids. I was a completely different person back then. Not in a bad way, just in the sense that I had the kind of free time and risk tolerance that I genuinely can't relate to anymore. I used to do these solo backpacking trips a few times a year, usually somewhere in the Appalachians. I would drive out to some remote trailhead, hike deep into the backcountry, way off the trail, and spend a few days completely off the grid. No cell service, no other people, nothing. I loved it. My friends thought I was insane, and honestly, I kind of was. This particular trip was in the Cherokee National Forest, and it changed how I see backpacking forever. I had been out there for 2 days, and everything had been going perfectly. The weather had been great, the trail was quiet, and I hadn't seen another person since the first morning. That changed pretty quickly, though. On the afternoon of the second day, I noticed dark storm clouds building up to the west. I wasn't too worried at first. I'd hiked through rain plenty of times, and it was never a big deal. But within about an hour, I realized it wasn't going to be a passing shower. The wind picked up hard, and the temperature dropped fast enough that I actually stopped to put on another layer. By the time the rain started, I was already looking for a spot to hunker down. The problem was that I was in a pretty exposed section of the trail. As I predicted, it wasn't a light rain. It went from windy to full-on downpour in minutes. The wind was bending smaller trees sideways, and I could hear branches cracking and falling in the canopy above me. I started getting genuinely concerned about my safety. Lightning was striking pretty close by, and I was hiking at elevation with a metal-framed pack on my back. Not ideal. I kept pushing forward, completely soaked at that point. I was scanning the woods on either side of the trail for anything that could pass as shelter. As if by some miracle, I actually saw a structure through the trees off to my left. It was small and dark and partially hidden by the forest, but it was unmistakably man-made. As I got closer, I realized it was a tiny one-story cabin. It looked extremely old, like it could have been a hunting cabin or a homesteader's shelter from decades ago. There was a single window on the side I was approaching. I can't overstate how relieved I was. I practically sprinted over to the thing and pushed the door open. Inside, it was dim but dry. There wasn't much in there, just a chair, a small table, and what looked like a cot frame pushed against the far wall. There was a stone fireplace on the right side that was clogged with old ash and debris. The place honestly smelled really bad, but I didn't care about anything other than stripping out of my soaked clothes and laying down. There wasn't a couch or anything in there, so I literally just picked a spot on the floor and lied down. I was in survival mode at that point, not exploration mode. All I cared about was that I was out of the storm. It wasn't until I'd been inside for maybe 10 or 15 minutes that I started actually looking around. With the storm raging outside, there wasn't much else to do besides flick on a flashlight and snoop. So that's exactly what I did. There was more stuff in that cabin than I had initially realized. For starters, there was a sleeping bag rolled up in the corner near the cot frame. It didn't look ancient like the rest of the place, which confused me. There were also a couple of cans and water jugs on the table, which made me think someone had been using the place as a base camp of sorts. Maybe another backpacker or a hunter. But the more I looked around, the more things started bothering me. There were marks on the wall near the door. At first, I thought they were just damage from age or weather, but when I got closer to inspect them, I could see they were scratches. There were dozens of them, some shallow and some deeper. There was no pattern or order to the marks. I stepped back and looked at the door itself. The handle was a simple latch. Despite the storm, I opened the door just to get a look at the mechanism. There was a metal bracket on the outside of the frame, which looked like it was designed to hold a padlock. The bracket was on the outside. There was no corresponding latch on the inside. That meant the door could only be locked from the outside. Things only got stranger. I shut the door and started looking around the cabin. The only thing I hadn't checked out yet was the window, so I walked over to it. The glass was still perfectly intact, which surprised me given the apparent age of the place. But then I noticed why. There were screws drilled into the window frame, one in each corner, securing it shut. Those had also been driven in from outside. And around the edges of the frame on the inside, there were more scratches, deep ones. These were unmistakable. They honestly looked like someone had tried to pry the window open with their bare hands. All of it hit me at once. Someone had been kept in this cabin, trapped, kept against their will. I should have left right then, and I did consider that. But there was a good part of me that felt like whatever had gone on in that cabin was well in the past. Everything in the cabin looked really old. Even the sleeping bag, which did look on the newer side, was rigid and dusty. Plus, the last thing I wanted to do was go back out in that storm again. So I stayed. I'm not sure how much time passed. Maybe an hour, maybe more. The storm wasn't letting up at all. If anything, it had gotten worse. The rain on the roof was so loud that it was hard to hear much of anything else. That's probably why it took me so long to notice the other sound. I picked up on the scratching or scraping noises from outside somewhere along the left wall of the cabin. At first, I thought it was a branch, but I couldn't remember if there had been branches low enough to even touch the exterior of the cabin. As I was thinking about it, I heard two heavy thumps on the porch. They honestly didn't sound like storm sounds. This time I stood up. I froze in place and tried to focus by staring at a random spot on the wall. I was trying to listen, but if someone was moving out there, it would have been impossible to hear over the storm. My eyes drifted over to the window. I couldn't bring myself to look through it. After a while, I started to relax a bit, thinking I had just been hearing the storm, or at the very worst, an animal poking around the cabin. I was almost ready to forget about everything when I heard something that sent me over the edge. Pressure on the door like someone was leaning their full weight against it from the other side. The wood creaked and the latch rattled once before the pressure released. My heart rate instantly shot back up, and that's when something clicked. Why would someone be outside in a storm like this, circling the cabin, tapping on the walls without just coming in? The door wasn't locked. Nothing was stopping them. And then I thought about what I'd found inside the cabin. It occurred to me that maybe whoever was out there didn't want to come inside. Maybe they wanted me to stay inside. Maybe the whole point was to keep me in there. I don't know if that was the right conclusion or if my mind was just spiraling, but I decided I was leaving right then. I didn't care about the storm. I started moving things into my backpack as fast as I could. I was maybe 30 seconds from walking out the door when I heard the sound of glass shattering behind me. I spun around just in time to see something come through the window, and that was all I could see before the whole room erupted in flames. The flames spread so fast that I couldn't even process what was happening. 1 second, I was standing in a dark room, and the next second the walls were on fire. The heat hit me like a physical wall, and the door wouldn't budge. It was jammed from the outside. I slammed into it with all my might, and it gave. It collapsed off its hinges and me with it. I scrambled to get back on my feet, and I just ran. I couldn't even see. I was just running wildly through the woods and rain, trying to put as much distance between myself and that cabin. But before I could get a safe distance away, I felt something tackle me from behind, and I was back on the ground. There was a person on top of me, and suddenly I was fighting for my life. I clawed and kicked and screamed, but this guy wouldn't get off me. He was yelling too, and he kept trying to get me in a chokehold. He was gouging at my eyes and pulling my hair, and I started to feel dizzy, but I managed to push him off. I got back up and kept running, and whoever had just tried to kill me was screaming like a maniac. I looked back twice. I couldn't see my attacker, but I did see the cabin, which was fully engulfed in flames. I think the picture of that fireball is burned into my brain forever. I didn't stop until my legs gave out. I found a spot where a couple of large trees had fallen against each other, and there was a narrow gap underneath that blocked most of the rain. I crawled under there and just collapsed. I couldn't feel my body. I don't know if it was the fire, the rain, or the attack. Maybe all three, but I was completely numb. All I did was sit in that crouch position and try to keep breathing. I don't know how many hours passed under those trees, but time lost all meaning. Eventually, I felt some feelings start to re-enter my body, and I told myself it was move or die. Whoever was out there was probably looking for me, and he couldn't have been that far away. So, I got up and started moving through the woods. I didn't know where the trail was, but I didn't really care. I honestly can't tell you how I survived that night, but I did. I stumbled onto a random trail and just followed it. I was soaked and probably bleeding from multiple places, but I just kept trudging on. Eventually, the rain subsided a bit, at least enough for me to figure out where I was. I made it to some random trailhead. By that point, the storm had passed. The first person I saw drove me to a hospital. I had second-degree burns on my left forearm and the back of my neck, and doctors told me I was lucky I hadn't inhaled more smoke than I did. None of it was permanent, but it hurt like hell for a long time afterwards. By the time I was healed and safe at home, I told myself I would never camp or hike alone again. Someone had intentionally set that cabin on fire to kill me. That's the only thing that makes any sense. It was pouring rain, a full-blown thunderstorm, and the roof was metal. There's no way a wooden structure goes up like that fast, unless the wood had been treated with something beforehand. I gave the police everything I could, but I could tell they weren't really going to do anything. And to be fair, I wasn't in a charted part of the woods. My wife would probably tell you I stopped doing solo trips because I grew up and got more responsible, and she's not entirely wrong. But I honestly never told her about this incident, and I know I'll never go backcountry trekking alone again. My name is James. This happened maybe 7 or 8 years ago, back when I was in my early 20s and still doing stuff that I probably shouldn't have been doing. I had this friend Charles who was kind of notorious in our friend group for finding cool places to explore, like abandoned buildings and old factories. If it was somewhere you weren't supposed to be, Charles had probably already been there and could tell you exactly how to get in. He spent a weird amount of time on Google Earth and these niche urbex forums, and he'd always be hitting the group chat with screenshots of random places he wanted to check out. Most of us would entertain his ideas, but never actually follow through. I was usually the exception. Charles and I had been friends since high school, and I think the reason we got along so well was that we had similar thresholds for risk. While most of our friends would hear his pitches and go, "That sounds insane," I'd hear them and go, "When are we going?" This story is about one of those situations. One weekend, Charles texted me about a fire lookout tower he'd found deep in some forest not far away from us. I really wish I could remember the name of the forest, but I can't. Charles said it had been decommissioned years ago and was just sitting out there in the middle of nowhere, completely untouched. He was convinced we could hike out to it, climb it, and spend the night up there. We picked a random weekend and made it happen. Charles planned the entire thing out, including the drive, what to pack, and how to find the tower once we were in the woods. It was a 3-hour drive away, and Charles told me the hike would be off the trail, but pretty short, about 4 miles or so. We drove out early in the morning on Friday and made it into the woods sometime in the afternoon. Seeing it through the trees for the first time was an insane sight. I remember blurting out, "No way," when I saw how tall it was. I was even more astonished when we got to the base of it and realized it was completely unprotected or fenced off. It was just sitting there in the middle of the woods waiting for us to find it. The cab at the top was this small square room with windows on all 4 sides. There was a metal staircase that zigzagged up the frame with a section of vertical ladder for the final stretch up to the cab. The whole thing looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Some of the lower railings were bent or missing, and there was graffiti on the support beams near the base. Charles was practically giddy. While I was hesitating, he had already started climbing. I yelled at him to be careful. We made our way up carefully. Most of the steps felt solid enough, but there were a few spots where the bolts had rusted through and the steps wobbled. The vertical ladder section near the top was the sketchiest part, 20-some feet of straight climbing with nothing but a narrow metal cage around it. The view from the cab was unreal. You could see for miles in every direction. We had timed it perfectly. The sun was maybe an hour from setting. We cracked a few beers on the wraparound walkway and enjoyed the view. Once the light was gone, the forest below us was just a black mess in every direction. The stars were incredible, but being alone out there in the dark was freaking me out a little. Charles started messing with me, and the thing that pissed me off the most was when he smacked his metal water bottle against the side of the tower. It sent this incredibly loud, echoing clang in every direction. I told him I wanted to go inside the cab. Before I could finish setting up my sleeping stuff, he told me in a very quiet, serious voice to come back outside. He was pointing diagonally downwards toward the forest below us. There was a light down there, faint and pretty far away, but definitely there. It was weaving through the forest at what seemed like walking pace, moving way too evenly, like it was floating. It kept getting closer. Then it suddenly zipped forward for a split second before returning to steady movement. After about 10 minutes, it reached the base of the tower and just stopped directly below us. We watched that light for 30 minutes. Charles yelled down, "Hey, are you good?" No response. I aimed my flashlight straight down, but still couldn't see the source of the light. Eventually, the light just disappeared. We went inside the cab and set up our sleeping bags, but neither of us were going to sleep. Not 20 minutes later, the noises started, metallic clangs echoing up through the steel frame of the tower. They weren't footsteps. It sounded more like someone struck one of the support beams with a wrench or crowbar. Then came grinding sounds, like metal being twisted against metal. The sounds kept coming from different spots. Then I saw something. A dark outline moved across one of the windows, then passed in front of the next pane. I yelled. Charles scrambled away. We immediately ran to the door and pressed our backs against it. We sat there like that for hours. By the time the sun started coming up, I was completely exhausted. When it was light enough, we swung the door open. Nothing there. We started descending as fast as we could. We made it about 3/4 of the way down when Charles stopped. An entire section of the staircase was gone, completely missing. Someone had deconstructed it during the night while we were sitting directly above them. We had to jump across the gap. Charles twisted his ankle, but we made it down. There was no one waiting at the bottom, and the missing steps weren't even lying there. I still don't have an explanation for any of it. Not the light, not the sounds, not the figure I saw outside the window, and definitely not how someone managed to remove an entire section of steel staircase in the middle of the night without us hearing it. Every time I see Charles, this is something we still talk about. I go camping alone a few times a year. I've been doing it since I was in my 20s, and at this point I'm in my late 30s, so close to 15 years of solo trips at this point. I know the risks, which is why I carry a rifle. This happened about 2 years ago in the Daniel Boone National Forest in eastern Kentucky. It's a massive stretch of forest, over 700,000 acres. And if you know where to go, you can hike for days without seeing another person. I had a rough stretch of work and my head wasn't in a great place. I felt like I just needed a few days away from everything. I drove out on a Thursday morning. I parked at a trailhead off a Forest Service road and started hiking. The plan was simple, 3 nights in the backcountry. The first day was exactly what I needed. I covered about 7 miles before finding a flat spot near a creek bed. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and had a fire going by the time the sun started going down. I cooked some food, drank a beer, and slept by the fire until it burned down to embers. I didn't see a single person. I fell asleep around 10 o'clock. I woke up at some point in the middle of the night. As my eyes adjusted, I noticed a faint orangey glow coming through the walls of my tent. I unzipped the tent flap and looked out. Maybe 200 yards away through the trees, there was a fire, about the size of a campfire, flickering. I watched it for a few minutes. No talking, no movement. I figured it was another camper who had left their fire going. I zipped the tent back up and went to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, I packed up and hiked in the direction where the fire had been. I found the exact clearing, but there was no fire pit, no ash, no scorched ground, nothing. The ground was completely undisturbed and pristine. I was certain I'd seen a fire, but there wasn't another clearing anywhere near the right distance or direction. I just moved on. That evening I found another campsite in a denser, older section of the forest. I doused my fire a little after 9 and turned in for the night. I woke up to this distant, enormous cracking sound, like a thick branch being snapped in half, except it kept going. It was violent and lasted for maybe 3 or 4 seconds, ending with a deep, resonant thud I could feel in the ground. A tree had fallen somewhere to the south. No storm, barely any wind. Not 10 minutes later, it happened again, much louder, from the northwest. Then came a low and continuous rumbling sound, a cross between a groan and a growl. It went on for what felt like a full minute without any break. It wasn't any animal I recognized. I grabbed my rifle, chambered around as quietly as I could, and aimed it at the tent flap. I sat like that for 20 minutes until the sound faded out. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as I saw daylight, I packed up quickly and started walking toward the second tree with my rifle ready. I found it after about 10 minutes. The trunk was massive, lying at an angle. The break wasn't clean. The wood around the break point had been torn apart, gouged with long, irregular grooves up to an inch deep. Bark had been peeled away in long strips. It looked like it had been stripped and chewed. As I was backing away, something near one of the branches caught my eye. There was a small cluster of items on the ground, a blue bandana and a carabiner. Both were mine. I checked my pack. They were missing. In that moment, I grabbed my stuff, shoved it in my backpack, and ran. The hike back took me most of the day. The entire time I felt like I was being stalked or watched. I kept my rifle in my hands the entire time. I made it back to my car around 3 o'clock in the afternoon and drove out of there so fast. The first thing I did when I got to a safe distance was call the police. None of it made any sense. My own items had been taken and left at the tree like a calling card. That unexplainable fire from the first night must have had something to do with it. Something had either stalked me through the woods or knew exactly where I was the entire time. I still go camping, believe it or not, but this is something that I think will hang over me forever.